The medical bay smelled of cleaning chemicals and something else that Velana could not name. She sat across from the broken soldier, her recording device placed carefully on the metal table between them. The alien before her looked nothing like the proud warriors she had seen in propaganda videos. Zektar shifted in his chair, the metal creaking under his weight. His blue-gray skin bore deep scars that ran from his neck down to where his uniform covered the rest. Where his lower left arm should have been, a crude metal replacement clicked softly as he moved. The prosthetic was basic, clearly military issue, nothing fancy. "You want to know about the humans," Zektar said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Everyone wants to know about the humans now." Velana nodded, keeping her expression neutral. As a war correspondent for the Hegemony News Network, she had interviewed many soldiers. But none like this. Zektar was the first veteran from the human front willing to speak on record. "Take your time," she said. "Start wherever you feel comfortable." Zektar's 4 eyes blinked slowly, one after another. It was a sign of deep thought among his people. "Comfortable," he repeated. "I have not felt comfortable since I returned from human space." The silence stretched between them. Outside the medical facility, Sanctuary Station hummed with activity. Ships came and went, carrying supplies and personnel to dozens of worlds across the hegemony, but none of those ships headed toward human territory anymore. "We thought it would be easy," Zektar finally said. "Command told us the humans were young, primitive. They had only been in space for a few centuries. We had been traveling between stars for thousands of years." He lifted his good hand and studied his clawed fingers. The briefings made it sound like a simple police action. Secure the human worlds, establish hegemony rule, integrate them into our society. Standard procedure. Velana had read those same briefings. The humans controlled only 47 star systems, all within a small region they called the Outer Rim. Their technology was crude by hegemony standards. Their weapons were kinetic projectiles and simple energy beams. Their ships were slow and poorly armed. "What changed your mind?" she asked. Zektar's laugh was bitter. "The first battle changed everything. We dropped out of hyperspace expecting to find scared colonists ready to surrender. Instead, we found humans who seemed eager to die." He stood and walked to the small window. The prosthetic arm moved stiffly at his side. "Do you know what a human looks like, Velana?" She nodded. Everyone in the hegemony had seen the images by now. Humans were small compared to most spacefaring species, standing only as tall as a hegemony adolescent. They had soft skin with no natural armor, weak jaws with blunt teeth, and only 2 arms. Most puzzling of all, they had only 2 eyes placed in the front of their heads, giving them terrible peripheral vision. "They look fragile," Zektar continued, "like something you could break by accident. The first time I saw one in person, I thought it was some kind of joke." He turned back to face her. That human was holding a position with nothing but a broken rifle and a metal bar. He had been shot 3 times. Any rational being would have surrendered or died. But he kept fighting. Velana leaned forward. "What happened to him?" "He killed 2 of my squad mates with that metal bar before we finally brought him down. And as he died, he was still trying to crawl toward us with a grenade in his hand." The recording device hummed quietly on the table. Zektar sat back down, moving carefully like someone much older than his years. "That should have been our first warning," he said. "But we told ourselves it was just one crazy human. The next world would be different." But it was not different. Zektar shook his head. Every world was the same. Every human we met fought like that first one. Men, women, even their young ones. They all had this same look in their eyes. What kind of look? Like they had already accepted death but decided to make it cost us as much as possible. Velana had trouble understanding this. In hegemony culture, surrender was honorable when facing impossible odds. It preserved life and resources for future battles. Fighting to the death served no logical purpose. Did you try to communicate with them? Explain that surrender would mean fair treatment? Zektar's 4 eyes focused on her with something like surprise. Fair treatment. Velana, we were invading their homes. We were there to conquer them, to make them part of the hegemony whether they wanted it or not. They understood this perfectly. He flexed his remaining natural hand, watching the claws extend and retract. Humans do not think like us. When we fight for territory, resources, strategic advantage. When humans fight, they fight for ideas. What kind of ideas? Freedom, honor, the right to choose their own path. He spoke the words like they were foreign concepts he was still trying to understand. They would rather die than lose these things. Velana made a note on her pad. The hegemony's philosophers had debated human behavior for months after the withdrawal. Some claimed humans were simply defective, unable to process logical choices. Others suggested they might be suffering from some kind of species-wide mental illness. Command kept telling us the humans would break. Zektar continued. Every species breaks eventually. Apply enough pressure, cause enough casualties, and any rational being will surrender. But humans seem to get stronger the more we hurt them. He stood again and began pacing, his heavy footsteps echoing in the small room. On Kepler 442b, we surrounded their mining station. They had maybe 300 defenders against our 3,000. We offered terms, surrender, and they could relocate to a reservation world with full rights as hegemony citizens. They refused? They laughed at us. Zektar stopped pacing and stared at the wall. Actually laughed. Then they sent back a message that I will never forget. He was quiet for so long that Velana thought he might not continue. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. They said, "Come and take it." The simple phrase hung in the air between them. Velana did not understand why it affected the veteran so deeply, but she could see the impact in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged. 3 words, Zektar said. Just 3 words. But in those words was everything we failed to understand about humans. He returned to his chair and met her gaze directly. They were not afraid of us, Velana. They were not impressed by our numbers or our technology or our empire spanning 1,000 worlds. They looked at the greatest military force in the galaxy, and they were not afraid. What were they? Zektar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Velana's skin crawl. They were angry. The attack on Kepler 442b began at dawn. Zektar remembered the way the twin suns cast long shadows across the mining complex as their dropships descended through the thin atmosphere. Everything had gone according to plan in those first few minutes. We hit their communications array first, he told Velana, his prosthetic hand tapping against the table. Standard procedure. Cut off their ability to call for help, then demand surrender. The mining station sat in a crater carved from the planet's surface over decades of ore extraction. The humans had built their facility like a fortress, with the main buildings deep in the pit and defensive positions along the rim. It should have been impossible to defend against an orbital assault. Our intelligence said they had maybe 50 armed security guards. Zektar continued. Mining equipment operators, civilian contractors, nothing that should have posed a real threat to a full assault battalion. Velana reviewed her notes. The official reports claimed the station fell within 6 hours with minimal hegemony casualties. Looking at the scarred veteran across from her, she began to suspect those reports had left out important details. The first sign something was wrong came when we landed, Zektar said. No return fire. No defensive positions manned. The whole place looked abandoned. His squad had advanced down the crater's edge, moving from cover to cover toward the main buildings. The silence felt wrong. Even abandoned positions usually showed some signs of hasty evacuation. Scattered belongings, open doors, vehicles left running. Squad leader Mortek thought they had all fled deeper into the mines, Zektar said. We were about halfway down when the explosion started. The humans had turned the crater itself into a weapon. Charges placed in the rock walls brought down tons of debris, cutting off the hegemony's retreat, while funneling their advance into narrow corridors between the rubble. That was when we saw our first human, Zektar said, his voice growing quieter. She could not have been much older than a hegemony youth. Small, wearing civilian clothes covered in rock dust. She was standing on a pile of debris about 50 meters away. The human female had been holding what looked like a mining charge in each hand. As the hegemony soldiers raised their weapons, she smiled at them. She smiled, Zektar repeated as if he still could not believe it. Then she threw those charges right into the middle of our formation and dove for cover. The explosion killed 3 soldiers instantly and wounded 5 more. In the chaos that followed, more humans appeared from positions that should have been impossible to reach. They moved through the rubble like they had trained in it their entire lives. We had superior weapons, better armor, military training, Zektar said. But they knew that terrain like it was part of their own bodies. Every pile of rocks hid firing positions. Every tunnel led to flanking routes we had not seen. The battle that intelligence said would last 6 hours stretched into its second day. The humans fought with whatever they could find: mining tools, improvised explosives, even chunks of sharp metal. They seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts. On the second day, we cornered a group of them in the main processing facility. Zektar said, 7 humans, including 2 that were clearly civilians. They had no heavy weapons, no way out. Any rational beings would have surrendered. Velana found herself leaning forward despite her attempt to remain professional. What did they do? They barricaded themselves in the smelting chamber and turned the industrial equipment into weapons. One of them, a female engineer according to her clothing, had rigged the ore processing system to spray molten metal. Zektar lifted his prosthetic arm and examined it with distant eyes. Sarah Chen. We found her identification later. She held that position for 6 hours against my entire squad. The human engineer had used every piece of equipment in the facility. Conveyor belts became moving cover. Magnetic ore separators became projectile weapons. The smelting furnaces became the source for streams of liquid metal that could cut through hegemony armor like paper. She had been shot 4 times, Zektar said. Her left leg was clearly broken. Any sane being would have collapsed from blood loss. But she kept moving, kept fighting. The hegemony soldiers had eventually been forced to bring up heavy weapons to breach the facility. When they finally broke through, they found Sarah Chen collapsed behind a makeshift barricade of metal plates. She was barely conscious, but her hand was still on the controls for the smelting system. She looked up at us as we approached, Zektar said, blood running down her face, obviously dying. And she laughed, like she had just heard the funniest joke in the galaxy. Then she looked at me specifically and said something I will never forget. Zektar was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a transport ship's engines rumbled as it departed the station. She said, "Tell your friends they are going to need bigger guns." Velana felt a chill run down her spine. The way Zektar spoke made it clear that Sarah Chen's words had proven prophetic. What happened to her? She died while we were calling for medical support, Zektar said. But her sacrifice bought time for civilian transports to escape through the deep mining tunnels. Over 2,000 non-combatants made it to the evacuation ships because one human engineer decided to make her last stand in a smelting facility. He turned to look out the window again. That was when I began to understand what we were really fighting. What do you mean? The other species we had conquered fought for survival. They surrendered when the cost became too high, when they realized they could not win. But humans do not fight just to survive. Zektar's reflection was visible in the window, his scarred face overlaying the view of ships coming and going in the darkness of space. They fight for each other. That engineer knew she was going to die. She knew her actions would not change the outcome of the battle. But she also knew that every minute she delayed us was another minute for those civilians to escape. Velana tried to process this. In hegemony military doctrine, sacrificing trained personnel to save civilians made no logical sense. Soldiers could be trained to fight again. Civilians could be replaced. The humans calculate value differently than we do, Zektar continued as if reading her thoughts. They see the life of a child as worth more than the life of a soldier. They see protecting the innocent as more important than tactical advantage. He returned to his seat, moving slowly like an old soldier despite his relatively young age. After Kepler 442b, Command decided we needed to adjust our tactics. The next assault would be overwhelming force from the start. No extended siege, no opportunity for human defenders to dig in and prepare. Did it work? Zektar's 4 eyes focused on her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The look of someone remembering horrors he wished he could forget. That is when we learned that humans get more dangerous when you give them time to prepare, but they get completely insane when you try to overwhelm them quickly. He flexed his remaining natural hand, watching the claws extend and retract. The next battle was at Terra Nova. That was where I lost my arm, and where I learned that Sarah Chen was right. We definitely needed bigger guns. Terra Nova had been a human colony for over a century when the hegemony arrived. The system contained 3 habitable worlds, but the humans had concentrated most of their population on the second planet. Unlike the mining station at Kepler 442b, Terra Nova was a proper settlement with cities, farms, and industrial centers. Command thought it would be easier, Zektar told Velana, his prosthetic clicking as he adjusted his position. A real colony with infrastructure to protect. Civilians who would pressure their defenders to surrender rather than see their homes destroyed. The war correspondent made notes as he spoke. She had read the official reports about Terra Nova, but they were heavily censored. Most of what happened there remained classified. We started with a blockade, Zektar continued. Cut off all supply routes, jam their communications, make it clear that resistance was hopeless. Standard siege tactics that had worked on dozens of other worlds. The hegemony fleet had surrounded the system with enough firepower to crack planets. The message to the human defenders was simple: surrender, or watch their entire civilization burn. They sent back a one-word reply, Zektar said. Same word we had heard at Kepler 442b and every other human world. No. No. He nodded grimly. Just like that. No negotiations, no requests for terms, no attempts to save their civilians. Just no. The siege had lasted 8 months. The humans had converted their largest colony ship into a fortress, moving their entire population into the massive vessel and surrounding it with defensive positions. It should have been a target-rich environment for orbital bombardment. That was when we discovered the first thing that made humans different from every other species we had fought, Zektar said. They were willing to sacrifice everything to deny us victory. The humans had rigged their entire industrial infrastructure with explosives. The moment hegemony forces approached any facility, the defenders would detonate it rather than let it fall intact. Factories, power plants, even hospitals. Nothing was left for the invaders to use. Within the first month, they had destroyed their own civilization, Zektar said. Hundreds of years of construction gone, just to make sure we could not benefit from conquering them. Velana struggled to understand the logic, but that would mean starting over completely if they won. Humans do not plan to lose, Zektar replied. They plan to make victory so expensive that their enemies regret trying. As the siege continued, the situation inside the human fortress grew desperate. The hegemony's intelligence reports showed massive overcrowding, food shortages, and failing life support systems. Any rational population would have demanded their leaders surrender. Instead, they got more creative, Zektar said. We monitored their communications. They were organizing children's choirs to boost morale, setting up schools and cargo bays, planning weddings and birthday parties while our weapons pointed at their heads. The humans had turned sections of their colony ship into farms, growing food in any available space. They recycled everything, water, air, even organic waste. When their medical supplies ran low, they began producing medicines from whatever plants they could cultivate. On month 3, we detected them moving large groups around inside the ship, Zektar said. Command thought they were finally preparing to evacuate. We offered safe passage for civilians if their military forces surrendered. The human response had been to paint a message on the outside of their ship in letters large enough to read from orbit. Come and take it. The same words from Kepler 442b, Velana noted. Exactly. But this time we understood what they meant. Zektar's expression darkened. They were not just refusing to surrender. They were challenging us to try. Month 4 had brought the first assault. Hegemony Marines boarded the colony ship expecting to face desperate defenders in the outer sections. Instead, they found empty corridors and sealed blast doors. The humans had evacuated the entire outer ring, Zektar said, pulled everyone back to the inner sections and sealed themselves in. Then they did something that still gives me nightmares. The humans had deliberately breached the outer hull in dozens of places, exposing those sections to space. But they had not just vented the atmosphere. They had flooded those areas with radiation from their damaged reactor systems. They created dead zones that our species could not enter, Zektar explained. We can tolerate much higher radiation levels than humans, but there are limits. They pushed those outer sections beyond what even our armor could handle. The irradiated zones became killing fields. Human defenders in radiation suits could move through them freely, while hegemony forces had to take long detours through cramped maintenance passages. Every corridor became a potential ambush site. That was where I lost my arm, Zektar said, touching his prosthetic, trying to clear a junction that 3 human defenders were holding with nothing but hand weapons and makeshift explosives. He described the battle in clinical terms, but Velana could see the emotional impact in his posture. The humans had used their own tolerance for radiation as a tactical advantage, creating environments where they could fight on equal terms despite inferior equipment. One of them was just a child, Zektar said quietly. could not have been more than 12 years old by human standards. She was operating a heavy mining laser like she had been born to it. The young human had held a critical junction for 3 hours against an entire hegemony squad. When they finally overwhelmed her position, they found her dead at her weapon with her hand still on the controls. Children, Velana said. They were using children as soldiers? Not using, Zektar corrected. The children volunteered. We intercepted communications, families arguing about whether their young ones should be allowed to fight. The humans considered it an honor. The siege dragged on through months 5 and 6. The humans continued to adapt, using their knowledge of their own ship against the invaders. They had turned maintenance tunnels into transit routes, converted cargo bays into command centers, and rigged every system to serve double duty as weapons. Month 7 was when we realized we were not fighting an army, Zektar said. We were fighting an entire people. Every human on that ship was a combatant, from the youngest child to the oldest civilian. The breakthrough had come in month 8, when hegemony forces finally reached the ship's central core. The humans had concentrated their remaining population in the reactor section, using the massive fusion plant as their final fortress. We thought we had them, Zektar said. Surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from everything. Command was already planning the victory announcement. That was when the humans played their final card. They sent us one last message, Zektar said, his voice barely above a whisper. A human male looked like he was in charge, standing in front of their fusion reactor with his hand on what was obviously a detonation control. The human commander had been calm, almost friendly. He had explained that they had rigged their reactor to explode with enough force to destroy everything, within 100 kilometers. The hegemony forces, their ships, even their own people, all of it would be vaporized. He gave us 10 minutes to withdraw beyond the blast radius, Zektar said. Then he smiled and said the most terrifying thing I've ever heard a sentient being say. Velana waited, her recording device capturing every word. He said, "See you in hell, boys." The evacuation had been chaos. Hegemony forces fleeing in every available ship, racing to get beyond the blast zone while human defenders continued firing at them right up until the final moment. Did they really do it? Velana asked. Zektar nodded slowly. The reactor went up exactly 10 minutes later, took out our dreadnought Eternal Victory, and 6 escort vessels. Over 12,000 hegemony personnel killed instantly. He stared at his prosthetic hand. And every single human on that ship, men, women, children, civilians, everyone, they chose to die rather than let us win. The silence stretched between them. Outside, another transport ship departed Sanctuary Station, its engines briefly illuminating the medical bay window. That was when Command realized what we were really facing, Zektar said finally. Not just another species to conquer. Something completely different. What do you mean? Zektar met her gaze directly. Every other species fights to live. Humans fight to win. And if they cannot win, they make sure their enemies lose too. He stood and walked to the window again. Terra Nova changed everything. After that, no hegemony commander wanted to assault a human position. They all knew that victory might cost more than defeat. Is that why the war ended? The war ended, Zektar said, because we finally understood what humans had been trying to tell us all along. Which was that some things are more important than living, and that anyone willing to die for their beliefs cannot truly be conquered. After Terra Nova, everything changed. The Hegemony Military Command ordered a complete tactical review of human behavior. Zektar found himself assigned to a new unit, Intelligence Analysis, focused entirely on understanding their enemy. We had captured some human equipment during the siege, he told Velana, settling back into his chair. Command wanted us to figure out how they fought so effectively with inferior technology. The first discovery had been the human data storage devices. Unlike hegemony systems that focused on tactical information and strategic databases, human computers were filled with something the analysis team had never seen before. Stories, Zektar said. Thousands and thousands of stories. Music, pictures, moving images, written accounts of their history. We thought it was just entertainment data at first. Velana made notes as he spoke. The official reports had mentioned human cultural materials, but provided no details about their content or significance. My assignment was to catalog and analyze these files, Zektar continued. Command thought understanding human entertainment might give us insight into their psychology. What he found instead was a complete record of human civilization. Stories of wars fought for freedom, tales of individuals sacrificing themselves for others, accounts of people choosing death over slavery. The pattern was consistent across centuries of human culture. One story kept appearing in different forms, Zektar said. The account of an ancient human battle called Thermopylae. 300 warriors holding a mountain pass against a massive army. The human king Leonidas and his soldiers had known they were going to die. The enemy force was 50 times larger and had surrounded their position. Any rational military commander would have retreated to fight another day. Instead, they stayed and fought until every one of them was dead. Zektar said, not because they thought they could win, but because their sacrifice would inspire others to resist. This pattern appeared throughout human history. Small groups choosing impossible fights, not for victory but to make a statement. Individuals giving their lives to save strangers. Entire populations choosing destruction over submission. We started interviewing human prisoners, Zektar said, trying to understand why they made these choices. The first prisoner had been a young human male, barely old enough to fight by his species standards. He had been captured during a raid on a supply depot and was expected to provide useful intelligence about human defensive positions. Instead, he spent 3 hours trying to teach us about something called honor, Zektar said, a concept that made no logical sense to our interrogators. According to the human, honor meant doing the right thing regardless of personal cost. It meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. It meant keeping promises even when breaking them would be easier. We asked him why he did not surrender when his position was overrun. Zektar continued. He looked at us like we had asked why he did not stop breathing. The human had explained that surrender would have meant abandoning his wounded comrades. His duty was to buy time for medical evacuation, even if it meant his own capture or death. The concept of abandoning injured soldiers to save himself was literally incomprehensible to him. That was when we began to understand that humans do not fight the same war we do. Zektar said, we fight for territory, resources, strategic advantage. Humans fight for ideas. The analysis team studied more captured materials. Human military manuals contained sections on topics that had no equivalent in hegemony doctrine. Rules about protecting civilians, codes governing treatment of prisoners, guidelines for when surrender was acceptable. They had laws about war, Zektar said, his voice filled with amazement. Rules they followed even when those rules put them at a disadvantage. One captured human officer had refused to reveal defensive positions even under interrogation, not because of military security, but because providing that information might lead to civilian casualties. He had been willing to endure torture to protect people he had never met. We interrogated him for days, Zektar said, offered him everything, medical treatment, repatriation, even citizenship in the hegemony. He just kept saying the same thing. What did he say? That some things were more important than his own life. The human had eventually died in custody, not from interrogation but from injuries sustained defending his position. His last words had been an apology to his family for not making it home. We found recordings on his personal device. Zektar continued. Messages to his offspring, his mate, his parents. All of them saying the same thing, that he was proud to fight for their freedom. Velana tried to process this information. In hegemony culture, family obligations took precedence over military duty. A soldier was expected to survive and return home to fulfill their role in society. Humans reverse this priority, Zektar explained. They believe that dying to protect their family's freedom is more valuable than living under oppression with them. The analysis team had studied human art and literature, looking for clues about this mindset. What they found was a culture that celebrated self-sacrifice, honored those who died for others, and viewed death in battle as meaningful rather than wasteful. One piece of human music kept playing in their facilities, Zektar said. A song about a place called Flanders Fields, where human soldiers had died fighting for freedom. He quoted the translated lyrics with surprising accuracy. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly. They remember their dead not with sadness but with pride, Zektar continued. Each death becomes inspiration for others to continue the fight. This explained the humans' seemingly suicidal tactics. They were not throwing their lives away, they were investing them in a cause that would outlive any individual. Every sacrifice strengthened their collective resolve rather than weakening it. We found children's books about heroes who died saving others, Zektar said. Stories taught to their young ones about the importance of standing up to bullies, protecting the weak, fighting for what is right even when the odds are impossible. The human concept of heroism was fundamentally different from hegemony values, where his people celebrated clever survival and strategic thinking. Humans honored those who chose death over compromise. One story particularly affected our analysis team, Zektar said, about a human ship captain who stayed with his vessel to save passengers, going down with the ship rather than abandoning his duty. The story was repeated in dozens of variations throughout human culture. Individuals choosing to die rather than abandon their responsibilities. The pattern was so consistent that it had become an expected behavior rather than an exceptional one. That was when we realized the truth about human warfare, Zektar said, his expression grim. They do not fight armies, they fight ideas. And you cannot kill an idea with weapons. Every human death in battle became a symbol. Every act of sacrifice inspired others to similar courage. The more pressure the hegemony applied, the stronger human resistance became. We were not just fighting 47 star systems, Zektar continued. We were fighting the concept of freedom itself. And that concept lived in the mind of every human civilian, every child, every non-combatant we encountered. Velana looked up from her notes. Is that when Command decided to withdraw? Zektar shook his head. That decision came later after we understood the final piece of the puzzle, which was, we discovered that humans do not just fight for abstract ideas. They fight for love. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his prosthetic hand. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than before. Every human soldier we captured carried pictures of their families. Every recorded message mentioned specific individuals they were fighting to protect. Their entire motivation was not glory or duty or conquest. It was love for other humans. This was the factor that made human resistance unbreakable. They were not fighting for territory that could be traded away, or resources that could be shared. They were fighting for the right to love and protect each other in freedom. You cannot negotiate with love, Zektar said. You cannot defeat it with superior firepower. You can only destroy it by destroying the ones who feel it, and that would mean exterminating the entire human species, something that would cost more than any possible victory could be worth. The decision to withdraw from human space came 18 months after Terra Nova. Zektar had been reassigned to a planning committee tasked with developing new strategies for the human campaign. What they discovered changed everything. Command ordered us to calculate the true cost of victory, he told Velana, his prosthetic hand resting motionless on the table. Not just military casualties, but the total resources required to pacify human territory. The numbers were staggering. Every human world would need to be completely conquered, not just occupied. The analysis team's research had shown that humans would continue resisting as long as any of them remained free. Partial victory was not possible. We estimated it would require the entire hegemony fleet, Zektar said. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon. A minimum of 20 years of constant warfare with no guarantee of success. Even then, victory would only come through complete genocide. The human concept of freedom was too deeply ingrained to be suppressed through conventional occupation. Every surviving human would be a potential resistance fighter. Admiral Vorthak asked the question that ended the war. Zektar continued. He asked what we would gain that was worth exterminating an entire species. The human systems contained some useful resources, but nothing unique. Their technology was inferior to hegemony standards. Their industrial capacity was minimal compared to established worlds. From a purely practical standpoint, conquering humanity offered no significant advantages. But the cost of failure was becoming clear, Zektar said. Other species had noticed our difficulties. If the hegemony could not defeat a primitive human civilization, what did that say about our strength? The war had already lasted longer than any previous conquest. Casualty reports that should have shown overwhelming hegemony superiority instead documented a grinding stalemate. Worse, human tactics were spreading to other resistance movements. 3 other species had begun using human-style suicide attacks, Zektar said. Apparently they were inspired by Terra Nova. The idea of making victory too expensive to achieve was catching on. The hegemony faced a choice: commit to total war against an enemy that would never surrender, or find a way to withdraw without appearing weak. The solution came from an unexpected source. A junior analyst suggested we had been asking the wrong question, Zektar said. Instead of trying to defeat humans, maybe we should try to understand what made them so effective. The final reports from the intelligence analysis team painted a picture of a species unlike anything in hegemony experience. Humans fought not from desperation or military conditioning, but from genuine belief in principles worth dying for. They possessed something we had never encountered, Zektar said. Voluntary courage, not obedience to command structure or fear of punishment, but individual choice to sacrifice for others. This realization led to an unprecedented decision. Instead of classifying humans as a conquered species or an enemy, the Hegemony Council voted to designate them as an independent allied species. The first time such status had been granted to a former adversary, the official announcement said the hegemony recognized human sovereignty in exchange for trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, Zektar said. What it really meant was that we were afraid of them. Velana looked up from her notes. Afraid of humans? With all their technological disadvantages? Terrified, Zektar corrected. Not of their weapons or their ships, but of what they represented. Proof that superior technology and overwhelming force could be defeated by ideas and determination. The withdrawal had been conducted with full military honors, presenting the end of hostilities as a diplomatic success rather than a defeat. But within the hegemony military, everyone understood what had really happened. We had been defeated by an enemy that refused to be conquered, Zektar said. That changes you. The veterans returning from human space brought back more than just battle scars. They carried new ideas about duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of service. Human concepts like honor and voluntary courage began appearing in hegemony military doctrine. After the war, our leadership instituted changes, Zektar continued. New decorations for voluntary acts of heroism, training programs about protecting civilians, guidelines for when soldiers could choose their own missions. These changes had been controversial. Traditional hegemony values emphasize collective efficiency and logical decision-making. The idea of individual soldiers choosing to risk themselves for abstract principles was foreign and potentially dangerous. But the veterans who had fought humans supported these changes, Zektar said. We had seen what voluntary courage could accomplish. We wanted our own forces to have that same strength. Some hegemony worlds had begun instituting what they called human-style military honors, decorations specifically for soldiers who volunteered for dangerous missions to save others. The recipients were celebrated not just for their success, but for their willingness to sacrifice. My own homeworld now has a memorial garden, Zektar said, not just for soldiers who died in victory, but for those who chose death to protect others. We call it the Garden of Human Honor. The irony was not lost on anyone. The species that had defeated the hegemony's greatest military force was now being honored by their former enemies. Human concepts were spreading through hegemony culture faster than any conquest could have achieved. Trade delegations started arriving within a year of the withdrawal, Zektar said. Humans coming to our worlds, sharing their culture, teaching our young ones about their history. These exchanges had produced unexpected results. Hegemony youth were fascinated by human stories of heroism and sacrifice. Human concepts of individual rights and voluntary service were taking root in societies that had never questioned collective authority. Some of our philosophers claim humans have conquered us after all, Zektar said with something that might have been a smile, not through warfare but through example. Velana considered this. The official reports had portrayed the end of the human war as a minor diplomatic arrangement. The reality seemed far more significant. Do you think the hegemony is weaker because of these changes? She asked. Zektar was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ships moving through space beyond the medical station. When he spoke, his voice carried a conviction she had not heard before. I think we are stronger, he said. Before the human war, our soldiers fought because they were ordered to. Now some of them fight because they choose to. That makes all the difference. He turned back to face her, his scarred features serious. Humans taught us that willing sacrifice is more powerful than forced obedience. That individuals fighting for something they believe in are worth 10 soldiers fighting because they must. The recording device hummed quietly on the table between them. Outside, another transport ship departed for destinations throughout the hegemony, carrying goods and passengers and ideas that would continue spreading human concepts to new worlds. Will there be another war? Valana asked. Not with humans, Zektar said immediately. We learned our lesson. You cannot defeat people who are willing to die for their beliefs by threatening to kill them. He stood and walked to the window one final time, watching the stars beyond the station's hull. But there might be wars with other species who have not learned that lesson yet, he continued. And when that happens, I suspect they will discover what we discovered. Which is? Zektar touched his prosthetic arm, remembering battles fought in irradiated corridors and desperate last stands in smelting facilities. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard experience, that humans make much better allies than enemies, and that the ideas they fight for, freedom, honor, voluntary sacrifice for others, those ideas make everyone who embraces them stronger. He returned to his seat one last time, facing the war correspondent directly. The human war changed the hegemony forever, Zektar said. We started it as conquerors seeking to expand our territory. We ended it as students learning that some things are more valuable than victory. The interview was over. As Valana gathered her notes and recording equipment, she realized that the scarred veteran across from her had given her more than just a war story. He had described the transformation of an entire civilization through contact with an enemy that refused to be conquered. One last question, she said. Do you regret fighting the humans? Zektar considered this carefully, his 4 eyes focusing on something beyond the medical bay walls. I regret the cost, he said finally. All the lives lost on both sides. But I do not regret learning what humans taught us about courage and sacrifice and fighting for something greater than yourself. He flexed his remaining natural hand, watching the claws extend and retract one final time. Sometimes defeat teaches more valuable lessons than victory ever could.